Welcome to the Experts on Mortgage podcast. I'm your host, Mike Eshelman. And today we are going to be talking about non-US citizen mortgage financing with Tammy Butler. So Tammy, welcome to the show. And this is, this is one of those that when you and I were talking about podcast episodes and you mentioned non-US citizen financing, it immediately took me back to when I started in the industry about 20 years ago, and I was a loan officer, very much a call center setup, right? Where it's a lot of loan volume going through, and we were buying a bunch of leads. And whenever I got to the declaration questions, I would just kind of pretty much just breeze through them. And I don't think I ever came across a non-US citizen loan while I was in production, but now it's quite a bit more prevalent. And when you and I started talking about non-US citizen loans, I draw a complete blank because I don't know how they're different. I don't know what the process is. If anyone had ever told me, yes, they're a non-US citizen. So before we get into that, give us a little introduction and some background on yourself and what you do, how you fell into the industry, and just kind of, some background.
All right. Well, definitely saying falling into the industry is a great way to say it, because I think like most people out there, I fell into the industry, graduated from college with a degree in education. And at the time, there were no teaching jobs available. So someone said, "Oh, you have a college degree. Why don't you audit loans for us?" I didn't even know what a mortgage was. But long story short, I eventually ended up being a top producing originator. I'm a master CMB. I've built technology in our industry, all the way up through assisting Optimal Blue with some technology. So I've kind of been there and done that in all aspects. Now I own and publish Mortgage Currency, and Mortgage Currency is the underwriting guidelines database that sales and operations will actually use because of the way that we organize our content. And one of the things that we hit upon is that there's this extreme misunderstanding of working with non-US citizens. Now, I'm gonna really outdate you here. Back in the early 80s, I was an originator in the Washington, D.C. area. So if you live in that area, you have high exposure to a very transient community full of people who were either immigrating at the time or full of people who were working and living there as foreign nationals. So we had quite a bit of an exposure to that. And I think that's where I kind of earned my chops, per se, when it came to working with non-US citizens. Now out here in Chicago, and fast forward all these years later, what we're seeing is obviously a large immigration group that has come over since you were originating, right, over the past 20 years or so. And because of that, banks and mortgage lenders are super confused when it comes to, these guidelines and how to handle it and what the paperwork means. And just like anything with the government, I like to equate the USCIS, which is the institution that runs all of this, with the IRS. It's got all kinds of forms and rules and everything else that goes along with it. So we have to try to understand and process that in order to see if it meets guidelines for actual mortgage loans.
Yeah. And so what would you say some of the biggest misses are from lenders when it comes to understanding how to assist non-US citizens for mortgage financing?
What we see a lot of times is that there is education in the operations piece, right? So we're going to educate our underwriters, we're maybe even educate our compliance folks a bit on how this works or what types of loans we should do so that we can avoid any sorts of buyback issues. But all that education really needs to be pushed down to the level of the originator and processor a little bit more, because many people are consumed with the fact, well, my borrower has this type of visa, would they qualify for a mortgage loan? But the guidelines don't mention visas. Oh. Okay, they don't mention what type of visa is okay for mortgage financing. In fact, what makes it more complex is that the agencies don't even give you much information on it other than to say things like they have to be legally present. They have to have, a job history. They have to have probability of continued employment. They have to show that, they'll be able to stay in the United States for a period of time. Very similar to things that you look at with a U.S. citizen. But the problem is that, how do we document all of these different aspects, right? The vernacular that goes on in this particular segment is crazy because the agencies will call them different things. USCIS will call them really horrible words like alien. If you have a visa, you're an alien in their words. So there's all sorts of different terminology out there. Mm-hmm. And so where I think lenders get most confused is that we've got cryptic agency guidelines. We have a general knowledge, lack of knowledge of understanding how the immigration system works, visa system, how you get through the system, which could take, up to 10 years even to become a permanent resident here, let alone a U.S. citizen. How do veterans fit into that? What types of visas? Because there are hundreds of visas, right? Can I work with that visa? And can I stay with that visa? So these are the sorts of things that we get caught up in, and it gets very complex and confusing because of that. A godsend would be if the agencies kind of defined it a little bit more than they actually do, but they don't. And I think it's that way potentially to, just kind of cover all their bases just in case something goes bad on a loan. So those are the things that I typically run across when it comes to confusion on this subject matter with lenders.
Yeah, it's interesting, and kind of wonder if something is going to improve over the years if immigration becomes, a larger and larger percentage of home buyers out there.
Right. Well, right now we have all sorts of asylees, people seeking asylum. We have people with temporary protection. We have people with permanent protection. Once you are officially granted asylum in the United States, once that's official and the judge has says, yep, you're granted asylum, from that day forward, you have the right to work and live in this country, okay? And you probably will not get kicked out of the country unless you do something egregious, right? Like some sort of crime or felony, that sort of thing. And so I tell my lenders, even U.S. citizens can go to jail for felonies. Your non-U.S. citizens could get kicked out of the country or go to jail, right? So there's always risk with people when you do mortgages. It's understanding, what is that risk and do I meet the documentation requirements? And when we look at the documentation requirements, how are you documenting that? What are you getting from them or from the USCIS that shows that you have met some of the basic criteria? Are they legally present? Do they have the right to work here? Do they have a employment history? Do they have probability of continued employment? So we start there with those 4 elements. And then it's good to build your guidelines off of that.
And so, the things you mentioned previously already to me sound complex, right? There's a lot of even just the vernacular being used, being different, across the board. But what else is there that makes financing non-U.S. citizens so complex?
Well, the second thing is you have to have a reasonable knowledge of how this all works. For instance, I just described the asylee program or seeking asylum here in the United States, right? So I may have somebody that's under temporary asylum or temporary protection. But if we look at temporary, as agencies probably aren't going to like that word, right? Because that means you have temporary protection. What happens if you no longer have protection? Yeah. Or you have temporary asylum. What happens if you're not granted asylum, right? So we can kind of say if it says temporary, we should approach this with caution and kind of look at it a little bit further. Then you've got others that have things like ITINs. ITIN's a big subject, right? And a lot of I-10 borrowers, that's their tax identification number. But if you look at, I actually do consulting with Unidos US, which used to be National Council of La Raza. So we were very heavily in the Latino and the Black and brown markets. And so if we look at some of this when it comes to I-10 versus Social Security number, if you have a Social Security number, you're permitted to work in the United States. Simple, right? If you have an I-10 number, you are not permitted to work in the United States for an employer. However, you may still pay taxes, which is why you have the I-10 number, and you may be self-employed. So now a lender says, wait a minute, I've got somebody that can't legally work in the United States and they're self-employed. Lots of risk goes off there, right?
Yeah.
So there's those sorts of complexity that go into it. Then they say, okay, next level of complexity. The USCIS during COVID got really backed up on renewals. So as you know, or may not know, when you are granted a certain visa status, then you have to renew that. You know, just like we renew our passports, they have to renew their visa status. And when you renew your visa status, you fill out your paperwork by a certain deadline, and you have that application that says you did it by a certain deadline, right? So you're golden. And the way that people like FHA or agencies like FHA will look at it, they say, listen, if they've already been renewed once, chances are good they're going to be renewed again. So let's go with that, right? And I think for the most part, Fannie is kind of on the same page. Freddie's a lot more strict when it comes to this. So when we look at that, it's like, okay, now what happens when COVID hits and the agencies are like a year behind in their renewals? So you've got a person that's expiring as far as their visa is concerned. You know that the system is backed up. Now what do we do if we're going to blow past that expiration? I mean, they filed their application in a timely manner, so
just like they were asked.
It goes through, right? But it is the government, so we're not quite sure how long that's going to take, especially during those times. So that's a complexity that lenders have to kind of sort through and build procedures around as to what they're going to accept. And then when we get to the secondary market, well, sometimes the investors are like, I don't know what to do with this. We're just going to put up types of visas that we've seen that we've done, and then we'll just make it that. And this is where we get this misnomer in our industry that the agencies are looking for types of visas. Again, are you legally present? Are you allowed to work here? How do you prove all of this? Do you have employment history, and do you have likelihood of continued employment? I mean, those are the things we look at for everybody. And so we have to kind of go back to ground zero in setting this up to make sure that we're doing that.
Yeah, what are some of the guideline barriers with the traditional secondary marketing products when it comes to financing?
I think it's a basic lack of understanding. You know, I've seen with a lot of the large investors, and I've worked with them directly to build their procedures, right? So they'll say, okay, here are our procedures. And I'll ask them, well, why don't you do this? And why do you have that? And they're like, we don't know. And I think what happens is some of this stuff is developed at the corporate level, right? And they vetted it out in their committee meetings. And then they put out a document and they say, okay, here are the visa types we're going to take, even though the guidelines don't say anything about visa types,
visas,
right? Yeah. Right, nothing. And so then they put it out and say, this is what we're doing. And then the underwriters say, well, I don't know. I mean, I've got somebody that's going to expire and it's in less than 6 months. So is that a good risk? And well, USCIS is backed up. Well, what do we do? Well, they don't know that they can go to USCIS, or the client can, and they can actually print off where they're at in the status, you know, as far as the pipeline flow, right? They can say application was submitted on time. Here's where they're at in the process flow. So as a lender, I should probably feel pretty comfortable that they did what they needed to do to renew. They have been previously renewed. Other areas where we see is what I call the immigration progression. And we see a lot of this. I'm a student. I came here to the US to go to university. Okay? We have an enormous amount of people from other countries in our universities. I graduate from the university. Now, because I happen to be specialized in something that the US really needs to have a lot of people employed in, but they don't have enough people in the US to be employed, I've been offered a position at Google. And Google says we need all kinds of, coders and computer science people. And so as a result of that, we can't get enough here in the US, so they'll go to universities. And so now I'm going from a student visa transitioning to an HB1 visa, which is specialty employee.
Mm-hmm.
And those two have two different meanings. And do you understand that transition and how you document that transition in order to meet the basic requirements of legally present, able to work, employment history, blah, 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 right? So understanding how all of that works, people say, they have a student visa, so we can't do that. Well, wait a minute, they were just employed by Google, and Google sponsoring them under an HB1. And there are times that I've contacted FHA directly, and I'll say, your guidelines aren't very specific when it comes to work authorization, employment authorization document. You state that you must have an employment authorization document, right? Okay. Some visas do not provide employment authorization documents. It's built into the visa. So no matter how you want to try with the USCIS, if you have a certain visa like an HB1, which is the right to work is built into the visa,
Mm-hmm.
then they're not going to give you an employment authorization document. That's for other visa types. But can I legally work here? Do I have an employment authorization document? And you'll get mixed messages even from the agency. Well, unless they have an EAD, we don't do the loan. Whereas others will say, well, if it's built into the visa, and so you get all sorts of different feedback, which confuses lenders even more. Now, I think that Fannie Mae probably has done the best job. They come out with a little graphic job chart or a little chart on non-US citizens, and that's very helpful. But there's still so many holes in what is and is not accepted. And then when I think back to DACA, these are people who were brought here as children.
Mm-hmm.
And because we haven't worked out our immigration laws in probably 30 years, they're now working adults, right? And they've only known this country, but they're not technically legally present. So are they legally present by the agency guidelines? Well, these are the kinds of battles that you have to face. So, and for instance, Fannie Mae will say, yes, we'll take those. And FHA, it was a huge battle, but finally they came out with some guidance that would be acceptable. Freddie Mac still says no. And then USDA has their own little system where they're hooked up with the USCIS in order to see if somebody would meet their guidelines. So you see how it gets all messy in our industry.
Very
and why
much
it's
so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, this is great information. So if a lender, if a broker, if someone comes across the first loan of someone that's a non-citizen, what would be your recommendation for them helping that consumer out? Resources that are available to help being able to work confidently with that consumer?
Well, if you know that you're going to be in an area where there's an immigrant population, which is virtually everywhere right now, right? Unless you are in some remote area. I'm here in Chicago. I mean, if you don't understand this, folks, you need to if you're going to originate loans, right? Or just about any other urban environment. And we have a ton of resources at my company, which is mortgageguidelines.com. It's pretty easy to go to. And we've got classes and documentation, and we tried to really kind of make that easier for people. But if you don't have access to resources like that, then I would recommend that you kind of digest what the underwriting guidelines are saying, and then take a look at your investor guidelines on non-US citizens, okay? Not foreign nationals, okay? Those two different terms. Foreign nationals are, I am a resident and a citizen of France, and I want to have a vacation home here in the United States in Colorado. That's a foreign national. So people who are actually living and working and, you know, trying to establish some sort of permanent residency here. Look at the investor guidelines. I did a class for MGIC, so I know that the mortgage insurance companies are offering some training on that as well, and just really start to take little bits of information. You know, I've been studying AI 15 minutes a day because I know that's where we're going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you got to take these little bits of information each day and just learn a little bit more about the process and the guidelines. You're not going to get a lot of love when it comes to the agency guidelines. You'll probably just get more confused. So I recommend seeking other sources in order to try to feel very comfortable with it. And of course, talk to people internally. Hopefully you have some sort of a support system within your company somewhere that somebody can kind of take you or guide a few of you through that process.
Well, Tammy, this was great. Thank you so much for joining the podcast and talking about this topic. It's like I said, when we first started discussing it, it was one of those things that popped up in my mind and said, I don't know what I would have done. I mean, obviously I would have gone to someone to start figuring it out, but I would have been stuck in the mud initially. So thanks for talking about it. Mortgageguidelines.com, correct, is where you have a lot of information. So please go check out the website. And thank you for listening to the Experts on Mortgage podcast. Tammy, have a great day.
Thanks, guys. Bye.